Hello, this is my new lazy content series. It's called Bad Substacks, and it will be about bad Substacks. Our first victim is Konstantin Kisin. He is a comedian and host of the podcast Trigonometry. I haven't listened to his podcast much because, well, it really sucks. So he's going to be our first victim. This article is about how podcasters, and we have to be honest here, by podcasters, he means Joe Rogan, should invite on less, well, he doesn't really define this, but less non-experts and more experts. Now, he doesn't really define what these terms mean, but I think we could pretty much guess what he means is that he wants Joe Rogan to invite more of his buddies on, and less people who disagree with his own personal viewpoints. So that's about as good as we're going to get as a thesis statement because, well, the article's not really good, so let's start.
Prepare for the unprecedented. I am about to admit I was wrong. For years, I have celebrated the rise of new media and its impact on our ability to seek truth, challenge false narratives peddled by legacy institutions, and transform the way we conduct our public debate. The rationale behind my thought process seemed solid. After all, the medium is the message. The reason I thought our conversations about politics, culture, and entertainment had become so fake was the rapidly shrinking soundbite in a media elite more interested in winning than learning. Journalism, academia, and politics merged into a monoculture, whose consensus rested primarily on the vigorous inhalation of gases emanating from their own backsides, into which they had firmly inserted their heads. "I don't know anyone who voted for Trump," was their mantra. Far from being a confession of ignorance and a lack of perspective, this phrase was uttered with pride at dinner parties to signal membership of the elite.
Alright, this is just a writing tip. What would really help make this section pop is providing examples. Otherwise, it comes off like you're making up a guy and getting mad at him. Let's proceed.
Class. The response from this contingent to the sequential dismantling of their core assumptions about the way the world works was an attempt to use credentialism to make reality go away. Experts think vaccinating newborns against COVID is essential. Now pipe down, mask up, and follow the science TM. In decades past, absent the ability to make their voices heard, the proles would have had to grumble away about big pharma in obscurity as people, mostly hippie lefties, had been doing for ages. But, thanks to the technological revolution which reduced the cost of running a major broadcasting channel from millions of dollars to the price of a smartphone, the era of gatekeeping was well and truly over. The discredited mainstream media continued to peddle lie after lie in an attempt to keep its political opponents from governing and being re-elected, but it then faced a powerful counterweight. Elon Musk ended the regime of censorship and enforcement bias in the digital public square of Twitter, declaring, "You are the media now," as major podcasts and YouTube shows secured audiences most mainstream media outlets can now only dream of. By the time of last year's presidential election in the US, the rise of new media had become undeniable, with many rightly calling it the podcast election. Curious, open-minded, inquisitive podcasters, unrestrained by the need to comply with corporate media message discipline and social media censorship, were finally able to speak freely, seek the truth and debate controversial ideas in good faith in front of grateful audiences of millions. So far, so wonderful. After all, what could go wrong with democratizing information? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. Just as the assumptions of the elite class were proved wrong by the actions of their fellow citizens during the era of Trump, Brexit and COVID, the assumptions some of us held about the future of the media are now crumbling before our very eyes.
Okay, so we're about 500 words or 7 paragraphs into this, and we're only now starting to get a vague statement as to what the article is actually about. This is not great craft, because most people stop reading after 1 or 2 paragraphs, especially if it's a really bad article like this one. You need to hook your audience at the start.
With politics becoming the primary form of entertainment in Western society, more of us now get our news and opinions from entertainers rather than serious commentators, and, just as importantly, we often struggle to tell the difference between the two. Having transitioned from a career in comedy to my current role as a writer, interviewer and political commentator, I can hardly complain about the meshing of culture, politics and entertainment.
I'll actually give Kisin some credit here. He at least is self-aware enough to know that his own content is entertainment, and that he personally has no special qualifications to speak on most of the subjects he speaks on. And I think that's perfectly fine. What should matter is the quality of his content, not if he has a degree, has a rich stepfather, or took a flight to Israel. This is more self-awareness than I can attribute to his buddy Douglas Murray.
And I am not complaining, I am merely pointing out that the incentive structures and thought patterns we would typically associate with the entertainment business are not the same as those we would expect to see in journalism or academia. This difference was perfectly illustrated in the recent debate between journalist and author Douglas Murray and comedian and podcaster Dave Smith on the Joe Rogan Experience, the world's biggest podcast. Officially, the full 3-hour discussion was mostly about the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, with Smith being in the so-called anti-war camp and Murray being a supporter of both Israel's campaign to eliminate Hamas and Ukraine's struggle to retain its sovereignty and independence. These conflicts in both men's positions have been debated endlessly. That part of the discussion is less relevant here. The much more interesting fault lines were exposed on the fringes of the debate. The conversation began with a discussion of Rogan's decision to host Daryl Cooper, a man described by Tucker Carlson as America's most important popular historian. Cooper himself has the self-awareness not to own the label of historian, instead describing himself as a storyteller. His latest work is a series whose aim is to show World War II from the perspective of the Germans. To those who have studied World War II extensively, like Murray, Cooper's comments on Tucker Carlson's show and in his podcast with Joe Rogan are obvious and, frankly, boringly familiar Nazi apologia. Far from being novel, the idea peddled by Cooper that Churchill was a warmonger who turned the invasion of Poland into a global war because he was funded by Zionist financiers formed the core of wartime propaganda fabricated by Joseph.
Okay, let's talk about citations and why they are important. Fundamentally, citations let me check if a fact you share is accurate or if you are accurately representing someone. Kisin completely fails to do that here. Maybe his paraphrasing of Mr. Cooper is correct. However, I have no way of knowing that without sitting through hours of Mr. Cooper's podcasts. I have nothing against Mr. Cooper, but I don't really want to do that. Citations allow us to review each other's works without necessarily fully knowing every fact and source conceivable. Because if that was required to peer review a work, then there would be nobody capable of peer review. At the very least, Kisin should have included some long pull quotes here, but unfortunately he does not. This is a 2,000 word plus article. He clearly spent some amount of time on it. It wasn't written on the toilet like a tweet. For a guy who's arguing that podcasters need to raise their standards, he doesn't seem to have a very high standard for his own writing. And I'll note that it's much easier to uphold high standards in writing than in a format like a Joe Rogan style podcast. On that style of podcast, you're live. You have to rely on what's within your memory to hold up the conversation. It's reasonable to expect people will make mistakes in that kind of environment, or maybe not be able to fully remember an important fact or properly cite something when pressed. But when you're writing, you have all the time and resources of the world. You can Google things, you can sleep on it and fix things the day after. You can ask for help from friends. You can include intricate citations. It is very reasonable to hold a deliberately written work to a higher standard than your average Joe Rogan style podcast, but this article doesn't really rise that far above your average podcast. If Mr. Kisin wants to lecture Rogan or Cooper, he should clean up his own house first.
Nobles. The argument Cooper advances, that millions of POWs and civilians died on the Eastern Front because the Nazis failed to plan properly for the invasion, is simply a lie. There is extensive documentary evidence which confirms that the reason millions of POWs and civilians died on the Eastern Front is precisely because the Nazis succeeded in their plans. Because Murray is educated on this issue, he assumes that everyone else, including Smith, is too.
Well, that's a really dumb assumption. In the podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience episode 2303, Murray is the one who introduces the subject of Cooper in World War II, not Smith or Rogan. Why would it be reasonable to have expected Smith and Rogan to have pre-gamed on the subject? And even if they did, why would you expect them to know everything? My day job is computer science, which that's a relatively narrow field. And sometimes a junior colleague tells me something I didn't know, and that's perfectly normal. It's okay. Any field has more knowledge than any one human being should be expected to know, so there's no shame in saying, I don't know a lot about that, can you please elaborate? And you have to keep in mind, on a show like JRE, it's not just about the people in the room, it's about the whole audience listening. Even if you think Rogan and Smith should know every little detail about World War II, that doesn't mean the audience does, and on a show like Rogan's, sometimes it makes sense to dig into the beginner stuff a little.
Exasperated, he tries to explain that, far from being revolutionary, these ideas have been pushed by discredited historians like David Irving for decades.
If that's true, actually argue it. Give me some Cooper pull quotes, give me some Irving pull quotes, compare them, make an argument, or better yet, work on debunking the actual underlying points Cooper makes.
Have you listened to his podcast though? Rogan interjects. It turns out Murray hasn't, and this is later used against him after the episode airs.
Well, no shit. Murray chose to confront Rogan for having the guy on, then admitted to being very unfamiliar with his content. That was an incredibly arrogant and stupid thing to do.
Unlike Murray, I have listened to Cooper's podcasts, including the one about the history of Palestine that people often cite in his defense. He details the persecution of Jews preceding the events he covers, so he couldn't possibly be anti-Semitic, is their argument.
Who's they? Name them.
From this, they conclude that he couldn't possibly be a Nazi apologist. The reason they make this logical error is that in the entertainment world words do not have meanings, they have feelings. And thanks to the woke left's misuse of the word Nazi for the last decade, in podcastistan the term is not a descriptive label, but a vague, meaningless insult used to cancel people. Unlike his opponents, Murray clearly understands that the term Nazi apologist has a defined meaning, and the fact that most Nazi apologists are anti-Semitic does not mean that you have to be anti-Semitic to fit that description. The Grok definition of a Nazi apologist is someone who defends, justifies, or minimizes the actions, ideology, or atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, often by excusing Nazi policies or promoting revisionist narratives that distort historical facts.
Grok? Really? You finally cite something and it's Grok? Would that ever fly in any kind of professional setting? Actually, would that even fly on Joe Rogan? How lazy are you?
Since Cooper does precisely this in several appearances on major podcasts, how his series on Palestine would change this reality is clearly as confusing to Murray who hasn't listened to it as it is to me who has. Indeed, one of the main areas of misunderstanding in the discussion is the role of expertise. He doesn't claim to be an expert, is Smith's riposte to Murray's suggestion that Cooper doesn't know what he is talking about. He uses the same defense when Murray questions Smith's own willingness to opine on geopolitics. The central critique of Murray here is that he is arguing from authority, which is what mainstream media has done for years to gaslight the public about everything from transgenderism to COVID to war. Smith and his supporters argue that the concept of expertise has been so discredited that he, and anyone else for that matter, is entitled to express any views about any issue they want. The audience, they say, can judge these views themselves.
Who is they? Even a Wikipedia wouldn't allow this. This is below Wikipedia standards.
Murray's attempt to dismiss such views on the basis that they don't align with expert opinion is seen as an ineffective argument at best and an attempt at credentialism at worst. There is a sliver of truth to this criticism. Engaging the argument someone is making directly is a much more powerful approach. But to suggest that arguments from authority are entirely invalid is silly. Almost everything you believe is based on an argument from authority. Light bulbs, for example, are a fairly unsophisticated and omnipresent part of our lives. Yet the number of people reading this article who are capable of explaining how they work without resorting to arguments from authority will be vanishingly small.
This is just sheer nihilism. Most people don't know how a light bulb works because they don't need to know. That doesn't mean they couldn't figure it out if they actually needed to. And that doesn't mean any claimed authority is correctly describing how a light bulb works. The expert's explanation, like anyone else's, should be subject to scrutiny. What even is this argument?
Small. I am not just talking about the fact that most people couldn't explain how electricity works. I am talking about the fact that almost everyone who can will only be able to do so by quoting the work of other people, rather than experiments and research they themselves have conducted. While Rogan seems to side with Smith in this exchange, it is highly unlikely he would adopt this same approach to his own areas of expertise. When it comes to mixed martial arts, his interview guests are the best of the best. The dazzling array of UFC champions, top MMA coaches, respected trainers and other experts does not appear to include comedians.
It turns out there's a really easy built-in way to find out if someone knows what they're talking about in MMA, and it's not some degree you hang on the wall, it's walking into an octagon. And sometimes athletes get away with doing things that are not by the book and their coaches hate. This is just a terrible example.
There is a popular clip on the JRE YouTube channel in which Smith breaks down why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. I was unable to find one of him breaking down BJJ moves, despite Smith possessing a similar level of expertise on both subjects.
How do you know that? What are you basing that on? What if Dave Smith takes BJJ classes and just doesn't talk about it on the radio? How would we know?
Smith and Rogan are irked when Murray expresses his befuddlement that Smith has become a prominent voice in the debate about Israel and Palestine without ever having visited the Middle East. The shock at the idea that someone ought to see things with their own eyes before commenting on them is palpable. Indeed, in the aftermath of the debate, Smith promoted a popular video in which Murray's statements to this effect are contrasted with his previous ridicule of the concept of lived experience. This is very low-quality thinking. If you do not see things with your own eyes, your opinions are, by definition, not your own. They are an agglomeration of opinions and facts you have gathered from other sources whose veracity you cannot properly evaluate. That doesn't necessarily make them wrong. Indeed, most of our opinions about most things are not our own. You know why? Because we get them from people we consider to be authoritative on the subject in question. You might call them...
This is just an asinine argument. I was at the 2024 Libertarian Convention. Does that mean my word on what happened there is necessarily more reliable than that of an outside observer? No. Why? Because I was shit-faced half the time, I was completely exhausted the other half, and I can only be in one place at once. It is quite possible, and in fact likely, that someone in 20 years who wasn't there will be able to build a more accurate timeline of what happened than I ever could. Sometimes having some distance from the subject actually helps because it gives you more objectivity. This is just so stupid.
Experts. The great trick being deployed here is to allege that experts can't be trusted while relying on a different set of experts. On Ukraine, the non-expert Smith is using the ideas of people he considers experts like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs. On World War II, the non-expert Cooper deploys the arguments of people he considers experts like David Irving. And so on and so forth. All opinions are valid and should be given a hearing. Scream the people whose entire media diet is made up of people who only push their preferred perspective. This is where Smith obtains the arguments he makes about countries he has never visited, from other people. And the arguments are then judged not on whether they are true, something Smith does not have the expertise to.
Okay, this is a good time to talk about a fundamental problem that runs through this whole article. So much of it hinges around this idea of the expert, yet Kisin never really defines the word expert. It's very slippery. It seems to mean different things at different times. In this case, it seems to be someone who would be qualified to address the truth or untruth of an argument. Maybe. It's not really clear. Just like most of the rest of this article, it's all just kind of a mush.
Assess, but on whether they sound true. This is why he routinely makes basic cognitive errors of the kind I described the last time he and I sparred over my viral Israel video. As for experience, the woke concept of lived experience was not ridiculed because experience doesn't matter. You would have to be deeply dishonest to deny that experiences are informative. If Michael Jordan claimed that there is a correct way to dunk a basketball based on his experience and conversations with Kobe Bryant, do you imagine Smith and his defenders would screech about MJ just using arguments from authority and lived experience?
I'm assuming Mr. Kisin was never an athlete, and that's fine. But when you actually are involved in athletics, you often find out that the most gifted athletes give you the most useless advice. Why? Usually because they have genetic gifts such that they could get away with doing things wrong. And that's how they've always done it. And it works for them. They've won championships. We can also use that for Douglas's primary argument. Could Douglas going to Israel give him special insights? Sure. Could it also leave him with biases that even he himself doesn't realize he has that can actively harm the quality or usefulness of his opinion? Also yes. Kisin's spin on the lived experience argument is just that, spin. The lived experience argument here has the exact same problems it had in social justice land.
The reason many of us pushed back against lived experience, other than the grading tautology, is that it was used as a way to say, you can't have this opinion on a certain societal issue because of your race, sex and/or sexuality. This expanded the concept of experience from personal experiences that all of us as individuals have, to a kind of generalized knowledge that certain groups allegedly possess by virtue of their skin color or other immutable characteristics. If Murray had claimed that Smith is unqualified to comment because he is not a Middle Easterner, for example, his critics would have a point. Instead, he merely pointed out that Smith might become more informed by visiting the region he opines about with such confidence and regularity.
I've already addressed the general form of this argument, so I'll address the specific form because it's especially absurd. Israel has laws on the books to deny visa to those who have expressed support for BDS, people have called for prosecution of Israeli soldiers for war crimes, and for those who are in general affiliated with anti-Zionist groups. So that's an ideological filter from the start. To even get in the country, you need to either be of a certain ideological disposition, or at least a good enough actor to cover up the wrong thing you do have. Israel also isn't a country that's especially kind to its dissidents. Ilan Pappé, an Israeli Jew who's one of its best historians, had to leave the country due to receiving too many death threats. Rachel Curry was an American girl who was ran over by a bulldozer for trying to prevent a Palestinian house from being bulldozed. Over 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza during the conflict. There are a lot of good reasons for someone with a lot of knowledge and strong opinions on the Israeli-Gaza conflict to not want to go to Israel, especially if there's someone with a public profile who is likely to be recognized. I will note that you almost never hear this argument used for countries like China and North Korea. The argument that you have to go to Israel to understand the conflict is an obvious form of special pleading.
Which brings us, finally, to the biggest sticking point of all. This is the strongest evidence of thought policing I have ever seen, says a popular comment under the debate video. And it's true. On numerous occasions throughout the discussion, Murray commits the greatest sin available in Podcastistan, suggesting that certain people shouldn't comment on certain things and that others should not elevate their voices. Such is the inability to think clearly about this that you would almost certainly receive less pushback for denying that slavery harmed black Americans or claiming the Holocaust didn't really happen. They simply no longer understand the difference between censorship, this must be banned, and morality, this is a bad thing to do. The world of entertainment is not driven by truth-seeking, and the claim that someone's ideas are false is no longer an effective critique. Podcastistan is a place where people scold the mainstream media for failing to live up to their standards on honesty and accuracy while having none of their own. Cooper is a case in point. Even among his defenders, few claim that what he is saying is actually true. That's not why they like Cooper. They like Cooper because he ticks every box on the new media checklist.
Alright, overall I'm going to give this one a D. Kisin did make a few attempts at humor, and I did appreciate the small bit of self-awareness he showed in acknowledging he himself is an entertainer who has no special credentials to speak on most of the issues he chooses to speak about himself. However, he almost never cites sources, most of the arguments he made are illogical, and the article itself is poorly structured. And he cited Grok. Okay, just for citing Grok, it's a D-.